Welcome to Age of Sigmar Strategy Academy. In this episode, I'll be discussing the Gloomspite Gitz. I'll be going over their lore, rules, and how to best use them in-game. Like most armies in Age of Sigmar, the lore is centralized around the army's deity. And when you have an army that's a conglomeration of a bunch of grots zoinked out of their mind, meatballs with teeth, and big hulking brutes with room temperature IQ, the deity in question ends up being a giant floating rock called the Bad Moon. It's a celestial body that randomly floats around the mortal realms, seemingly without any rhyme or reason. For most, it acts as a harbinger of doom. The ominous glow of the Bad Moon throws cities into disarray. The maddening influence of its otherworldly light spreads rapidly, plunging once orderly streets into turmoil. Its sickly illumination causes mushrooms to burst from skin, and brings grotesque transformations to the populace below. And for the normally sedentary Gloomspite Gitz, it has a much different effect. Instead, they are driven upward from their underground layers, invigorated with power and ambition from the Bad Moon, attacking those on the surface. Because of their unwavering devotion to the Bad Moon, being able to predict its course is an ability that is held in high regard. And Skragrott is the one grot above all that is able to do so with pinpoint accuracy. He is able to do so thanks to his collection of seers and prophets that he has magically turned into horrific, gibbering mushrooms that he keeps in his fungal asylum. These scry shrooms will occasionally cry out predictions of the Bad Moon's course, and other notable prophecies, ensuring Skragrott stays in charge as the one true Loon King. His fungal asylum is a great example of how their use of bizarre plans, strange fungal magic, and their specially transmogrified beasts of war mean that even in a world with living demigod soldiers and towering undead constructs, that the Gloomspite Gitz are just of a threatening force to behold as any other. But how is all of this represented in-game? So the general gameplay of the army is that it's a melee army, but pretty much all of your units have great stats for the cost, and have access to very powerful spells, model regeneration, to represent the unending hordes of this army, and have all-around great support pieces that other armies would kill for. Additionally, the internal balance allows for a variety of units to be fielded, and seeing all of the remarkably distinctive and beautiful models on the table together is truly a sight to behold. Although, all of this comes with the downside of debilitatingly bad bravery values. Almost all of your units have bravery 5 or worse, and the army lacks any real consistent way to mitigate this, besides inspiring presence, so you'll need to use that command wisely. For specific in-game rules, the Bad Moon has just as meaningful of an effect as it does in the lore, giving your units that are covered in its sickly glow special buffs based on their keywords, moving semi-randomly around the board. The Bad Moon starts in a table quadrant of your choosing, and at the start of each battle round, after the first, you roll a dice, and on a 4-up it moves one step forward. First step bringing it to the middle, then the next step bringing it to the opposite table quadrant, and then finally off the table. While it's in a quadrant, all units wholly within the quadrant are under its light, and if it's in the middle of the board, the whole board is under its light. For what the light does, if you're a squig, you get run and charge. If you are a Moon Clan keyword unit, you can rally on a 4-up, and your Moon Clan heroes can issue rally 3 times. Moon Clan units are your grots and squigs, meaning squigs sort of double dip on buffs from the moon. If you're a Troggoth, you get a bonus to your save, which synergizes really well with the natural regeneration that every Troggoth unit has. And if you're a Spider, your poisonous 6s to hit mortal wound attacks, also mortal wound on 5s. Overall, all of these are solid bonuses, and good enough where you'll want to play around gaining them. And thankfully, the army gives you some interesting ways to do so, besides the Bad Moon itself. Most notably, this faction's terrain piece also emanates Bad Moon energy for units wholly within 12, so you can at least ensure for the first turn the majority of your army can benefit from these buffs. Additionally, the terrain feature brings back your dead non-hero units with 5 or less wounds at half strength at the end of your turn on a 4-up, which is just a fantastic thing to have, and makes your large reinforced units extra valuable, since they can still get you value later after they're killed for the first time. For sub-factions, none of them actually unlock Battle Line, but instead most of them give you buffs for specific kinds of units, heavily incentivizing you to bring those units. Starting off, King's Gitz allows you to re-roll the dice for bringing back units from your Loon Shrine. This is good since the difference between getting a free unit or not can swing a game hard in your favor, but also this subfaction can be pretty useful no matter what units you bring, since every other subfaction has its bonuses locked to specific keywords. Jaws of Mork make it so your squig units get an extra bite attack if they charged that turn. Glog's Megamob make it so your Troggoths regenerate after fighting, and Bad Snatchers has a real interesting effect. Whenever one of your Bad Snatcher Moon Clan wizards casts a spell, if they're by another Bad Snatcher Moon Clan wizard unit, you can re-roll one of the dice for the casting roll. This would be fantastic if it weren't for the fact that both of your named wizard units are keyword locked to King's Gitz, and your Spiderfang wizards lack the Moon Clan keyword. So annoyingly, most of the wizards in this army are locked out of this otherwise great effect. And lastly, Grimscuttle has a weird deep strike ability. To put it simply, spider-heavy armies have basically always been questionable competitively for this army, and this subfaction just doesn't fix their problems. And good luck trying to make a meaningful deep strike with a model who has a 160mm base. If I was absolutely dead set on doing a spider-focused army, I'd still skip this subfaction entirely in favor of King's Gitz. Although I should clarify, not all the spider units in this army are bad. They're just better off supporting your other unit options rather than being the front and center of your list. Out of the 5 sub-factions, the general consensus is that the power level for all of them is as follows. Jaws of Mork and King's Gitz being the best, Glog's Megamob and Bad Snatches having decent effects, but a couple things holding them back from being amazing. For Glogs, it's mostly that the extra healing doesn't do that much for you, since Trogs already heal each hero phase. For some Troggoth players, they just prefer playing in King's Gitz. And lastly, Grimscuttle obviously being the worst. For units, this army actually has a ton of solid options, and no unit is a true auto-include. But you have to pick and choose, since points are relatively tight now that the army got nerfed a couple times for being too strong, so you won't have room for everything you'll want to have in a list. List building for Gitz is all about caring for the precarious balance between covering all of your bases with the different main units, while bringing just the right amount of support pieces to get the most out of those units. The second part is extremely important. This army has so many amazing support pieces and utility pieces, where you'll often wish you could bring them all. So, what better place to start than to talk about our main hammer units that we will be building around? Squigs and Trogs. For your Squig troops, you have 3 kinds, but the basic Squig herd are often the most impressive, having some of the best stats in the army. They have amazing wounds per point, in fact some of the best in the game, solid movement, hero phase model regeneration, and the unit does decent damage that can be buffed in a variety of ways. Surely there has to be a catch to all of this. Well, you'd be right actually, since they have a bravery of 3, which normally wouldn't matter because of inspiring presence. But they actually have a special rule which means that they can't receive commands at all. Which, well, I guess is fair. I mean, you can tell a squig to go do something as many times as you want, but it doesn't actually mean it's gonna do it, you know? So oftentimes, if half of the unit gets wiped out in a turn, the other half will flee to Battle Shock. But not all is lost, as for each squig that flees, you have a decent chance of getting some damage against the closest enemy unit. Overall, they're great. But where the real magic comes in is with the new hero that was released alongside the Battle Tome, the Squig Boss. While he practically dies to a stiff breeze due to his 4 wounds and 6 up save, it does a lot for its points. Biggest bonus is once a game at the top of the hero phase, you can have all Squig Herd units within 12 inches make a normal move, practically doubling their movement that turn. The most common way to use this is to pair this guy with a reinforced or double reinforced unit of Squigs, and then in your first turn, you can launch your Squigs forward, and right into the enemy's face, maybe killing a unit or two, but most importantly, now your opponent has a wall of 48 to 72 wounds just in their face that they can't really ignore. And even if they do end up killing them all, the Squigs will be back at half strength when they pop out of the shrine. And that's just the tip of it. The Squig Boss has 3 different buffs he can pick from to buff any Squig unit within 3 inches. All of which are useful for pretty much any of your Squig units. But the short range of the ability will take some planning. In-game, when you use this guy, you will want your blob of Squig Herd to be in a specific formation after they make their start of hero phase move, where while a majority of them are in the front, you want to have a string of Squigs to be just within 3 inches of the Squig Boss, so we can still give the unit a bonus in the hero phase. So overall, on top of pairing incredibly well with big blobs of Squig Herd, he is a staple unit for any Squig-heavy armies. For your other Squig troops, there are Boingrot Bounders and Squig Hoppers, and while they do look similar, their abilities and stats effectively mean they fill different roles. Boingrot Bounders are your standard cavalry hammer unit. 5 of them can clear a screen without much issue, and a reinforced or double reinforced unit can crack open more important units very well. Squig Hoppers, on the other hand, rely on their strength and numbers to be a real nuisance to the opponent, focusing on running or retreating to steal objectives while doing mortal wounds on the way. Out of these 2, I personally prefer Boingrots, since they are a lot easier to get value out of, since they play more like a regular hammer, not having to do weird movement tricks to do solid damage. Hoppers also sort of face 2 barriers to being good. Firstly, they were hurt a decent amount by the nerf to Rally, which put a cap of returning models to 10 wounds, which made running larger units of them much worse. And that used to be a pretty scary threat, since at full capacity, they could do 15 mortal wounds with a single move, and if not wiped out in one swing, also could quickly regenerate lost models with their 4-up rally from the Bad Moon. Additionally, currently the basic Squig Herd just do the kind of strength and numbers strategy much better than Hoppers can. Hoppers are pretty close to being decent though. They just need a bit of buff somewhere to get them into a better spot. I will admit, a unit of 10 can still be okay to run if you have the models and you just want to round out a list. Now, if Squigs aren't your style, then may I introduce you to Rockgut Troggoths. Under the light of the Bad Moon, they have a 3-up save, and have a base 5-up ward, pack damage 3 attacks, and chuck rocks at nearby enemies. These are one of the few cases in the game where GW made a fun and powerful brawler unit, since while they're extremely slow, all of their other stats are great enough to make up for it. In my opinion, a couple units of 6 of these make a great addition to a Gitz list. But if you really want to juice them up and run a real Trog-heavy list, you will absolutely need a Dankhold Trog boss, who is one of the best general options for this army, hands down. His main ability is that when he issues all-out attack to a Troggoth unit, you also get to add 1 to the attacks characteristic of that unit, which the Rockgut Troggoths desperately need, since they only have 2 attacks apiece, and getting another attack effectively makes them do 50% more damage. He also has a bunch of random other abilities, but what makes him such a fantastic hero is the enhancement options. For command traits, Loonskin is the most popular option, allowing you to bring a Gloomspite Gitz endless spell in your list for free, rather than paying the nearly 100 points that each one costs. and also the ability for this unit to cast it like a wizard. Being able to bring even more stuff in your list with no downside, alongside the fact that it acts as a mini arcane tome, just makes this insanely powerful, and why it's so popular. The endless spell I'd recommend the most for this would be Scuttle Tide, for some ranged damage output which this army lacks. It does some minor damage, but it has infinite range, so it's great for harassing backfield units like Stormcast Long Strikes. But Alpha Trog is a decent option as well because it turns your Troggoth into a monster, which is great because of how good the Roar monstrous action is. Stopping commands is just one of the best effects in the game. For artifacts, you really only have one option, and that's the Glowy House It, which gives the bearer a 4-up ward until they accidentally eat the artifact. A 4-up ward doubles the survivability of this hero, meaning the opponent will have to throw a stupid amount of resources into killing it while the artifact is still active, which is almost always not worth it. So you can force your opponent into a difficult decision just by having this big dumb idiot stand there and be nearly impossible to kill. And don't forget, all Troggoths regenerate, so unless they kill this dude in one swing, there's a decent chance all progress they made will be mitigated after a battle round passes. Just try to avoid rolling a 1, since losing that 4-up ward and getting caught with your pants down can be pretty unfortunate. But for an off-meta option, Speaky Skull Fetish is decent. You get extra command points to work with, and you can issue a command twice instead of once, which is great for the all-out attack bonus, or Inspiring Presence to mitigate the awful bravery of this army. So, in this hypothetical Trog list, you have your wall of rock-cut Troggoths, with their leader supporting them from behind. But as a final cherry on top, there are Fellwater Troggoths, which are less durable but trade that for some utility. Much like llamas or your average New Yorker, they spit at their enemies. And if the spit attack successfully allocates damage, meaning it gets through their save and ward, then the affected unit has -1 to its save characteristic and can't make its save better until your next hero phase. Against the right target, this is extremely crippling, but the slow movement of this unit and the short range of the shooting attack pretty much means that this is best used to counterpunch and punish enemy units that overextended. My preferred way to use these are as a pack of 3 to accompany a pack of 6 Rockguts, as a nice 1-2 combo to ensure even the tankiest of units will have their saves completely shattered. Now, of course, no good army, whether it uses squigs or trogs, is complete without some throwaway unit to keep your more important stuff alive. The best thing for that job is the good old simple Stabbas and Shootas. These are your basic Grot units, and one of the few native battle line options. You get 20 in a pack, so while they lack meaningful damage, they make up for it in pure numbers. Both units can have a few models armed with nets, and you will always do this, since it makes them give out an aura of -1 to hit. Therefore, these little guys end up popping up in the majority of Gloomspite Gitz lists. For the differences between both flavors of Grots, Stabbas are melee-oriented, have a better save thanks to their shield, and can contest objectives while they're within 9 inches instead of within 6 inches of an objective while they have 20 or more models. It's a pretty crazy effect for a screen to have. And for Shootas, they get shooting attacks with pitiful damage, but a great range of 20 inches. I don't know how these green idiots are able to construct crude weapons that outrange most of the Kharadron Overlord's arsenal. But I guess that's the power of believing in the Bad Moon and rules balancing. For which unit is better, it's honestly really close, and you could use either. Personally, I've found I prefer Stabbas, mostly because I end up running and retreating them so often, and I enjoy that +1 to save. But like I said, both units are good enough where you could run either. Competitive lists have had success with both. For support units, it's impossible not to talk about Gabapalooza, since for the points, they are incredibly efficient, and the closest thing in the army that I would call an auto-include. They're a unit of 5 unique grots, and each model does its own unique thing. But the most important models are these three. Boggle-Eye and Shroomancer are wizards, and Spiker buffs a Gloomspite unit's rend by 1, which both of your main hammers, Trogs and Squigs, benefit greatly from. They also have a ward that gets worse over time, but it starts off at a 4-up ward, so your opponent is forced to overextend their resources if they want them dead early on. Additionally, since this unit isn't a hero, it's the only wizard in the army that can be revived with the Shrine, and since you revive units at half strength rounding up, when they come back you can bring back the best 3, Boggle-Eye, Shroomancer, and Spiker. It works out pretty well. But of course we can't forget about Scragrot. I spent like a whole paragraph in the lore section talking about him for a reason. He has an absolutely loaded war scroll. He is a double caster with +1 to cast, knows the entire Moon Clan spell lore, has a 4-up ward, emanates bad moonlight to all units within 12, gives out a free command each turn, and can control if the bad moon moves or not once a game. And on top of all of that, he has a war scroll spell with a casting value of 3, meaning he will only fail it if he miscasts, and the spell does damage based on the unmodified casting roll, which is great for sniping out other small foot heroes, since this gets around Look Out Sir. If you don't feel like magic is what you want, Grincrack the Great is also pretty great. Grincrack himself only has one ability, but it's a doozy. In the combat phase, you can dub a Moon Clan unit within 3 inches, and let them fight on death for the phase. And remember, in Age of Sigmar, doing things when you aren't supposed to is powerful. That's basically true across the entire game. It's also why moving Squig Herd in the hero phase is so good. So by extension, getting fight on death is amazing. Using this on a unit that already fought in combat can mean that the unit effectively got to fight twice, doubling its damage output. Even just using it defensively is great, since it means the opponent can't just lift the dubbed unit without being punished. For the most part, this ability is best used on Squigs, since they are the Moon Clan units with good melee attacks. Although, when using this, it does take some planning, since he does have to be pretty close to whatever unit he has to dub. If you want to have the ability to dub a unit that will be farther up the board, you can employ a similar strategy as I mentioned with Squig Herd and the Squig Boss, where you just string back some models to keep them barely in range. And that works out pretty good with Squig Herd, since that was already something you were doing. And for the free unit that Grincrack gets to bring, his Loon Court, they can bodyguard for him and mostly just act as a screen, but can go on a little quest which gives them a 4-up ward if they complete it, which is cute. While neither of these two are at a point where I'd call them an auto-include, they are both extremely popular in Gloomspite lists, due to their respective interesting abilities. For your more standard foot wizards, you have a few options, these being the Madcap Shaman, Fungoid Cave Shaman, and Web Spinner Shaman, and all 3 of these are solid and have their own niche. But the Madcap and Web Spinner are the most popular, just because of how cheap they are, at 70 and 65 points respectively, which makes them the cheapest wizards in the game, and great for filling battalions like Command Entourage or Warlord for more enhancements, or the Antorian Acolytes battalion for more magic dice. But for more points, the Fungoid will generate command points, and can once a game cast any spell from the Moon Clan lore. Zarbag is the last foot wizard option, and is decent since the free unit you get alongside him are relatively wound dense for the cost, and can bodyguard him for free. And he gives some pretty unique utility. He gets 1 to 2 casts a turn, and he has 2 interesting War Scroll spells. One forces an enemy to retreat, and the other make it so an enemy can't benefit from positive modifiers to hit, wound, and most importantly, save rolls, which can really neuter big monster heroes, which like to save stack with things like Mystic Shield, Finest Hour, and All Out Defense. Main reason why he isn't used is quite simply, points are tight, most lists just don't have the room for him. Now, all of the wizards I've mentioned are neat, but what spells should we be giving them? Out of the lore of the Moon Clans, There is one spell that reigns above all, and that's the Hand of Gork, which is a standard teleport with a fantastic range. This gives you some extremely important versatility, whether it's to move your important support pieces into place, or to position a unit to grab an objective or score a battle tactic. If you have any magic in your list, you will need to make sure you have at least one wizard who can cast this spell. Itchy Nuisance is also great since it can shut down an enemy hammer unit. The other two spells aren't bad, but not crazy enough to want to use for your spell or enhancement. They're better off just being casted by Scragrot or by a Fungoid whenever their niche use case comes up. For the Spiderfang lore, I'm mostly looking at this from the perspective of what would be best for our cheap Spiderfang Shaman, and Sneaky Distraction is a fine choice. But with the most recent season, our small wizards got access to a new spell lore, the lore of Primal Frost, and the absolute best one for Gitz has to be Hoarfrost, because of how powerful it is for squigs. All of the bite attacks for your squig troops unfortunately hit on 4s, but can easily be brought to a 2-up to hit, which dramatically changes their damage output. Even if you end up rolling a 3 for the defree for Hoarfrost, getting rend 3 attacks on your squigs is great. It's a win-win situation. And for the last important pure support unit, we have a weird one, Sneaky Snufflers. They have a great effective wounds to point ratio for a support unit when you consider their 5-up ward, and for their main ability, they can forego moving in the movement phase to instead collect some mushrooms to give a friendly unit a 5-up ward, if they roll a 3-up. And if you roll a 6-up, they also get to add 1 to the attacks characteristic of the unit they picked. And if you're under the bad moon, you can add 1 to the roll, meaning the 5-up ward will only fail if you roll a 1, and 33% of the time, they will also be giving the +1 attacks. Now, you'll want to be getting as much mileage out of this ability as you possibly can, which means buffing a large unit that wants to get in combat. And, once again, that ends up being your main squig troops, since running something like a double reinforced unit of Grots feels a bit questionable, and your big units of Rocket Troggoths already have a 5-up ward. Now, of course, this unit does come with the complication of not being able to move properly. The best way to get around this is to use Hand of Gork, and like I said, you will be bringing that spell in your army anyways. Spore Splatta Fanatics arguably have one of the best buffs out of any support pieces. Just a flat +1 to any Gloomspite unit's attack characteristic. But they are very unwieldy due to their random move characteristic, and the fact that the friendly units need to stay wholly within 9 inches. Even if you do get the stars to align with them, what will most likely happen is they will die almost immediately if your opponent has any ranged output at all, even if it's bad ranged output. Since for 90 points, you get 5 wounds on a 6-up save, and absolutely no defensive ability to speak of. So personally, I'm not the biggest fan of them. But their attack bonus is good enough where I'd have to mention them, especially since some people have done well with them at events. Loonsmasher Fanatics are less of a direct support unit since it doesn't buff your own units, but it does allow you to do some real wacky things. So, they can hide in a MoonClan Grot unit at the start of the game, and pop out at the start of the charge phase whenever you want to. And when they do, they have the Strike First effect. So if you pop them out in your opponent's turn right in front of a unit that was about to charge, they're now put in an awkward spot, since if they charge, firstly, they don't get to charge the target they probably wanted to, and now they have to deal with something that is also striking first and does solid damage. On your own turn, releasing them gives you a nice glass hammer unit that can often take down stuff that is worth more than they are. Last bit of utility they have is if they're hiding in a unit and it gets teleported to be 9 inches away from an enemy unit, they can then pop out 3 inches and end up 6 inches away from the opponent, which makes for a pretty easy charge out of a teleport. And this is a pretty scary threat to have in your back pocket. Now for the section for all the units that don't really fit into what I'd call a core build-around unit or a support unit. Many of these I'd also consider pretty middling competitively, since while they do something unique, they have something that holds them back. Starting off, we have the Loon Boss on Mangler Squig. He is the biggest Moon Clan hero this army has access to, and one of the few monster heroes. What sets it apart from the other squigs is its unique monstrous action, which allows it to make a 3d6 move after it charges, as long as it stays in combat. But it can fly, which means it can hop over screens and straight into your opponent's back lines to cause some havoc. It can also inspire other squigs once a game with an aura of +1 to wound rolls, which is a pretty rare buff in this army. As it's a hero, it can get enhancements, and my favorite combo for this big guy would be the Fight Another Day command trait to sometimes bounce right out of combat after fighting, and the Clammy Cowl to give it a better chance of living if it ever gets caught out. It's very entertaining to see this thing move a total of 5d6 after charging. And of course, there's the non-hero Mangler Squigs, which are pretty much just like the hero, with less attacks and no once-a-game aura. One big issue that both of these have is their inconsistency, since they bracket extremely fast and will get bracketed quickly due to their weak defenses. But also, their main bite attacks do d6 damage, which can't be relied on. Sure, it's a funny idea to throw one of these into your opponent's back lines, but they can easily whiff and feel disappointing. Overall, there's rarely a reason to bring more than one Mangler Squigs, and plenty of lists skip it entirely. On the topic of hero monsters, this army also got a new Troggoth recently, Trug the Troggoth King. His main thing is he has some ancient arcane technology stuck to his back that he can whack and get 1 out of 6 special different effects. The most standout effect would have to be rolling a 6 to get a 5-up ward, but getting +1 attacks is not bad given how high value his attacks are. And making shooting attacks only hit on 6s would be a nice trick to pull against shooting armies. With 4 dice, you only have about a 50-50 chance of actually getting a specific buff, so it's entirely possible to go the entire game without hitting the one you want. Overall, in a regular Gitz army, he really doesn't do much and just isn't that particularly good in my opinion. However, along with his release, he did get some special army rules called an Army of Renown, which I'll go into detail in the list building portion of this guide. Next big monster hero the army has is the Web Spinner Shaman on a Ragnarok Spider. And out of all of the big spiders, this is probably my favorite, because it gives the most utility thanks to being a double caster, with an aura of +1 to cast, to friendly Spider Fang wizards. And there are some semi-interesting enhancements for it to have, like Supa Nasty Venom and Totem of the Spider God. Just ignore its monstrous action. I can barely even imagine a real use case for it, it is so niche. The Scuttle Boss is also not too shabby, with its solid stats, but overall suffers from the fact that it's a small hero that doesn't do much supporting. The one reason I'm talking about it instead of simply labeling it as trash is the fact it has access to an interesting artifact, where it can only be hit by attacks if they roll a hit roll of 5 or 6. Some big hero monsters will just completely whiff sometimes against that, and could be pinned in place by this little idiot for a couple turns, and I guess that's kind of compelling. The last spider unit I could feel good about recommending would be the basic Spider Riders. You can either use them in a block of 5 as a fast, cheap screen, or a larger unit could do solid damage with some support. In fact, I'd argue great damage if the stars align. Just don't forget my warning from before, for most lists, spiders should not be your main focus. There is also one more Troggoth that's worth noting, the Dankhold Troggoth, not to be confused with the previously mentioned Dankhold Trog Boss. And stat-wise, it's whatever. It's competing with the other Troggoth troops, and it doesn't really stand out that much. But it can sometimes spike hard on its attacks, since it has a club that does d3 plus 3 damage, and it's part of a unique core battalion, where a Trogboss and it can get you an extra enhancement, which is interesting to consider. But that'll cover it for the worthwhile units I'd recommend. For the units I think are bad, instead of going through all of them one by one, I'd rather save some time, since this video is already a bit bloated. So I'm just going to put them all here with my reasoning. You can pause the video if you're interested in the specifics. Admittedly, for most of these, I wouldn't label them as unusable, since dedicating 100 or 200 points in a list to a unit that you like won't hurt you that much. Just if you're trying to play a competitive list, you're better off ignoring them and playing with the previously mentioned units. Now, with basically every unit covered, let's get into how we're going to use all of these in a real list. I'll be sharing lists that either did well at events, or slightly modified versions of them. Starting off, I want to talk about King's Gitz. The main upsides of running lists in this sub-faction is you get to bring both Squig and Troggoth units together in a single army, and they work rather well, since they cover each other's weaknesses. So for list building a King's Gitz army, I'd say that this is the core that you should probably start with. This isn't the only way to start a list, but if you're a new player and you do work towards an army like this, you will end up with a fun and competitively viable list. I promise you, you will not regret it. Going into specifics, you have a Squig Boss and Squigs for some reliable early game plays, and a collection of Trogs and Scragrot for some mid to late game punch. And of course, a screen of Stabs or Shootas. Already a pretty well-rounded list. But after all of that, you have 540 points to play around with, for some personal flavor. For me, this is how I'd spend those points. I love Gabapalooza and basically never leave home without them. And then I'd bring a second blob of 6 Rocket Troggoths, so I have another melee hammer. And this list ends up at 1970 points, which gives me a decent bid at gaining a triumph. Speaking of triumphs, basically all the time for this army, you pick Indomitable to be the triumph of choice. It's just so useful to have in an army that is this sensitive to battle shock. But for other solid options, one list that won 4-1 took this core and opted to add another 3 Rock Guts to the unit of 6, bringing it to a terrifying unit of 9. Not a lot of units in the game even have a chance of living that. And a Madcap Shaman for some extra magic. Most notably, they also made a pretty interesting off-meta choice of bringing a Regiment of Renown, Big Grix Cruel Shots, which bring in a few Cruel Boys units and give the list some nice long-ranged mortal wound output, which otherwise the army completely lacks. If you aren't a big fan of non-Gloomspite units in your Gloomspite lists, you can just bring another 24 Squig Herd in the list instead of the Regiment Renown, and have a pretty solid army. Next, we have my favorite side of the army, a Jaws of Mork Squig list. This list right here is similar to the kind of list I most enjoy for Squigs, where you have a big double reinforced unit of Squigs and heavily build around them, with a unit of Sneaky Snufflers to give them a 5-up ward, meaning there are effectively 108 wounds that fight on death thanks to Grin Crack. You also have some Boingrots and a variety of other buff pieces for a rather solid list. Interestingly, this list also has a Cruel Boys unit with the allied Marsh Crawlis Sloggoth, and it's really good since it gives a huge aura of +1 to hit, which is an effect that is pretty hard to give Squig Herd, since they can't get all-out attack. But if you want to run Mangler Squigs, this list right here went 4-1 and has a Loon Boss on Mangler Squig as the general, with the enhancement options I discussed earlier to help with its survivability. Another key element of both Squig lists is they have Boingrot Bounders, since, as I mentioned before, they're just a great hammer. For Troggoths, this list right here is a great place to start. At the top of the list we have our Dankhold Troggoth as the general, with all of the great enhancements I went over before. And he is a key part of our grand strategy, which requires we keep him alive and under the Bad Moon's light for 3 battle rounds, which is rather easy to complete given he has a 4-up ward with Glowy Howsit, and we have Scragrot to keep him under the Bad Moon's effect for basically the whole game. And of course, we have some big blocks of Rockgut Troggoths who will be accompanied by a small unit of Fellwaters. Lastly, as a final touch, to make sure you don't immediately get tabled by an Alpha Strike army, you have a couple screens of Grots. The main game plan for this list is to slowly waddle up the board and punish the opponent hard for trying to get close, And it's pretty effective with how killy a buffed up unit of Rotgut Troggoths can be. For subfaction, you can either go to King's Gitz or Glog's Megamob. It honestly doesn't really matter. It's more up to your personal preference. But if you really like Troggoths and don't want to use any of these measly little grots, as I mentioned earlier, there is an entire rule set for Gloomspite dedicated to the new Trug hero. It comes with the restriction of only being able to use Troggoth units, meaning you lose out on pretty much all of your buff pieces and utility wizards. However, doing so gives you a new set of command traits, artifacts, and the ability to make it whenever Trug uses his magic wheel of random effects. All Troggoths get the ability until your next hero phase, not just Trug. So your whole army could get +1 attacks or a 5-up ward, which is great, albeit not that consistent. And for enhancements, I think it's fair to say that the Gloomspite Gitz ones are just better overall. So personally, I'm more of a fan of generic Gloomspite Gitz armies over this army of renown. But if you're the kind of person who got into the army to only use these big hulking idiots, then it's actually a half-competent option. This list here is pretty simple. You bring pretty much all of the regular Troggoth units that you normally would, plus Trug himself, who is the reason why you play this anyways. The command trait makes it so that sometimes nearby enemy commands will fail, and the artifact means the general becomes a monster. Also, you may be wondering, did I make a mistake? Why is this list only at 1930 points? No, that's correct. Basically, just with the way points work out, and the extremely limited options, it's pretty common that lists for this will end up rather underpointed. If you want to get around this, the best way to do so is to put an Arcane Tome on your Trog boss, and put an Endless spell in your list. I think Geminids is a pretty solid option for that. Now let's get into something wacky and real off-meta. I called a lot of the units in this army bad, and that's mostly because if you're a newer player getting into the army, there are just better choices you can make. But clearly, even those units can have some success with a smart pilot for the army, as this list right here went 4-1 at an event, and honestly I barely understand how. Now admittedly, there are some pretty interesting parts of this list. The hero choices are solid enough, and the double reinforced unit of spiders could do some real nasty mortal wounds if they get all the right buffs up. And of course you have stuff like Moonclan Shootas and Gabapalooza, since they're just great staple units. But the reinforced unit of Snarlfang Riders is wild to me. Overall, I won't pretend like I have the best understanding of this list. I just think it's important to recognize that above all else, being a skilled player is really what matters. And that's basically everything I have to say about Gloomspite. I'd like to thank everyone for their support and bringing the channel to 1,000 subscribers. It's a small milestone, but it's awesome to see. Also, special shout out to my Patreon members like Travis Keltner. The support from them means a lot. If you want to be cool like them and be forever immortalized in my videos, check out the description below. Becoming a supporter has cool perks, like extra voting power on future video topics. Speaking of which, if you're watching this video within a week of its release, then you can vote on which army gets to be covered on the channel. Currently, the options are Soulblight Gravelords, Khorne, and Nurgle, with Nurgle in the lead. Every vote counts. The last one between Ogres and Gloomspite ended up being pretty close. That's it from me. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you here again soon.